How we doing, everybody? Welcome back to the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room. I am Jason C. If you're a subscriber, glad to see you back here. If you're not, you're looking for the latest in whiskey and bourbon news and reviews, you have found the right channel. So think about hitting that subscribe button below and hitting that bell notification so you know when I'm putting out a new video. So today we're reviewing the brand new Legent Bourbon from Beam Suntory. This bottle right here brought together two whiskey legends in collaboration to create this special bottle. Let's get into it. So it's not often that two whiskey masterminds collaborate in the creation of something brand new, but Fred Noe, Jim Beam's master distiller, and Shinji Fukuyo, Suntory Whiskey's chief blender, have been quietly working on exactly that for the past several years. These two represent such different sides of the whiskey world, not just geographically, but fundamentally speaking. So Legent begins life as a Kentucky bourbon matured for 5 years. This represents the biggest chunk of the final product. The other two pieces of the puzzle see that same bourbon get finished in different casks. The first batch gets finished in California red wine casks, and then the second finishes in sherry casks. All are run together by Shinji Fukuyo. So Fred Noe distilled the product using Jim Beam's standard bourbon mash bill, which is 76% corn, 12% rye, and 10% malted barley. Noe also added that the product was an education from my perspective on the blending. I learned a lot about blending different liquid streams. So Shinji Fukuyo brought his art of blending to the table, but first he needed to learn about bourbon's character and the production process. He said that we don't have the mash bills concept and bourbon is made in a continuous still, so it's totally different than Japanese whiskey. So he had to taste a lot of Fred Noe's bourbon samples. Not a bad job. This included fresh distillate all the way up to bourbon aged for over 10 years. He became familiar with all the character of the Kentucky whiskey itself and how it changes over time. But the really interesting part, I thought, was what he learned was Kentucky's geographical impact on the maturation process. He wasn't too familiar with the bourbon climate. Japan's climate is way more consistent than Kentucky's climate, which leads to speedier maturation. So in the end, Fukuyo and Noe led a tasting together to unveil Legent, with each of the three components tasted alongside the final blend. So they had the regular straight bourbon, then they had the sherry cask finished bourbon, and then they had the wine cask finished bourbon. In this way, it was easy to see the influence and impact that both men and their skill sets had on the process of the blend. All right, guys, so here's a closer look at the Legent bottle. I think there's definitely a Japanese whiskey influence to this bottle shape. Definitely stands out. As I mentioned, Legent Bourbon is a collaboration between the two halves of Beam Suntory. So you have the Kentucky bourbon made by Jim Beam master distiller Fred Noe. That includes three components. So the first is the bourbon itself, matured for approximately 5 years, along with parcels finished in California red wine casks, supposedly for about 1 extra year. And then another parcel in sherry casks for approximately 2 years. The whiskeys were then blended by Suntory chief blender Shinji Fukuyo. Legent is available now as a permanent member of the portfolio, and it's bottled at 47% ABV and carries an MSRP around $35. So let's open it up here. Let's get a pour. All right, let's get into it. So before we get started, I want to thank Union Wine and Liquors in West Islip, New York for helping me get this bottle out here to Ohio to review, since it's not here yet. If you live on Long Island, they have really fair prices and great service. Really like them a lot, so go check them out, Union Wine and Liquors in West Islip. So as you guys can see, I've sipped on this a couple times just to get some air into it and open it up so I can give you, a pretty accurate review of how it's going to taste when you sip it down a little bit. The first time I had it, it was really, really sweet on the palate, on the nose, and it was good, but a little bit too sweet for my taste. Second time I had it, more of that bourbon influence came into play. Definitely had that Jim Beam flavor profile to it. So now this is the third glass I'm having with you guys. So let's get into it, see if it's changed at all. Here we go. Wow, so right off the bat, it seems the blending now. The first time I had it was very sweet. Second time, more of that bourbon flavor came out. Now I'm getting on the nose a good mix of both. I'm getting a lot of fruit, a lot of wine influence from the sherry and the red wine cask finishing. It's very grapey, like grape red wine. Really, really strong on the nose there. Yeah, you taste. I feel like I'm getting more of the red wine than the sherry. I mean, the sherry is definitely prevalent, but the red wine is really coming through. I think more than the sherry finish. Definitely super sweet, kind of like a jamminess to it a little bit. Some strawberry, but if you really get down deep in there, you do pick up some of the Jim Beam flavor profile. You're getting some of that. They call it the nutty character, that nutty characteristic, which in turn gives it kind of a peanut butter and jelly type flavor on the nose, which is really interesting. Yeah, the fruitiness, the grapes, the strawberry, that nutty characteristic you get from Beam. You do get the bourbon in there. Very interesting nose. So let's go into the palate and see what we get. Cheers. Oh, wow. Okay. Wow, so it's definitely changed a little bit over time. It's definitely opened up now. It's, one thing that this whiskey has is a really good mouthfeel to it. It is pretty mouth coating. It definitely sticks around the palate. Being 94 proof, it almost feels like it's a higher proof than it is. It's got a decent finish to it, but it's definitely coming in with a lot of sweet flavors right off the bat. So let's go in for another sip. Here we go. Wow, interesting. So it was really, the first sip was very sweet. A lot of that wine influence, that strawberry wine, grape flavor, that sherryness, a little bit of that nuttiness was coming through. And then right in the end, it kind of turns into that Jim Beam flavor profile, that nutty characteristic to it. Then you're getting a little bit of the vanilla, the butterscotch, a little bit of the oak in there. Really, really interesting whiskey. Let's go for another sip here. All right, so third sip, the flavors are flattening out a little bit. And now you're getting more of a typical bourbon flavor profile. So definitely more caramel, a little bit more oak, some good amount of vanilla in there too. It's really good on the palate. The finish though, it's so crazy because you're getting that sweetness and then you're getting a little burst of peanut to go along with it. So you get that roasted peanut characteristic that you get in a Jim Beam product. It's really interesting. It's still kind of offering that peanut butter and jelly type aspect to it. But the finish, even though the flavor profile is flattening out a little bit, the finish is what's really kind of sticking around. That black pepper that you get from a good Jim Beam bourbon, really sticking around on the palate. Let's go in for another sip here. All right, so see now, once you sip it, now you start getting a little bit more of the sherry influence. Sherry, I feel like, really balances out a bourbon really well. It's not overpowering it though. What I was scared when I first opened this bourbon was I really thought that the combination of red wine and sherry was going to overpower the bourbon flavors. And that's really not happening here. If anything, the bourbon is starting to take over the sherry and the wine the more you sip on it. So it's really kind of bringing a kind of a well-balanced experience once you get into the last few sips. So let's go for one more sip. Here we go. Cheers. I'm liking this more and more the more I sip on it. It's definitely gotten better from the first sip I had, which is really, really sweet. Now the balance is really starting to come in very nicely. The wine and the sherry is playing well together, but it's not overpowering the bourbon. Now this reminds me a little bit of the Wild Turkey Mattress Keep, the revival, how they were able to finish it in those sherry casks but not overpower the bourbon. You're still getting that bourbon characteristic through. I think in the beginning and when you're opening this bottle and you try it, you're going to think probably it's way too sweet. But if you give it a little bit of time, this really opens up and then the bourbon characteristics really come through very nicely on this bottle. All right, guys, so Legent Bourbon here is $35. I've seen it priced a little bit higher in some places, but if you're into finished bourbons, I really think you should pick this up. It's really great for the money. Like I said, when you first open it, it's definitely going to be a little bit overly sweet. At least my bottle was. It took a couple pours for the bourbon to really come through and really balance out the sweetness of the sherry and the wine finish. I think they play really well together, especially with the Jim Beam having that nutty characteristic. When you compare it to these other finished whiskeys, other finished bourbons, that are, somewhere upwards of 60, 70, over $100 in today's market, this is an absolute steal. So if you're into finished bourbons, I would highly recommend picking this up. With one caveat, just give it some time to open up. Don't be scared by those first couple sips and all the sweetness, because they will balance out, and what you're left with is a really delicious, flavorful bourbon for the money. All right, guys, well, thanks again for watching the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room. Really appreciate you coming by. If you've had this, let me know down in the comments. Always like to hear your feedback. If you've had this, if you've had the same experience I did. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. If you haven't yet, find me on Instagram and find me on Twitter. Like I always say, it is not about the whiskey, it is the people you share it with. Hope you enjoyed the review, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.